Okay, it is recording. So, go ahead and just introduce yourself and a little bit about your background.
Okay. Well, I'm Wendall Potter. I spent 20 years inside the health insurance industry. I was an executive at Humana and Cigna. I was head of corporate communications at Cigna when I left in 2008. I'm a former journalist, and I was a person who just felt conflicted toward the end of my career in health insurance. I became increasingly aware that the health insurance industry was creating a lot of the problems that we have and are having such a hard time solving in this country. The practices of the health insurance industry have contributed directly to the rising number of people who don't have insurance. We now have more than 50 million people in this country who don't have insurance. And I'm also the author of a book called Deadly Spin, and I wrote that book just to explain how this happened, how we happen to have a healthcare system that is so much controlled by health insurance companies.
Great. Now, many people contest that figure of 50 million. Whenever you see this debated in the national press, people from the right or people against sort of uniform healthcare will always, it's not 50 million, it's as low as 5 million, it's as low as...
Right.
So can you just talk about that figure, please?
I can, and I understand that, because one of my jobs inside the health insurance industry was to make people believe that, say, what's the big deal here? There aren't that many people who are uninsured, and even if there were, a lot of those people have decided to not buy insurance. They're just not being responsible citizens. I know that's not true. In fact, that was one of the reasons I decided to leave my industry. I could not in good conscience continue to mislead people. There are, you're right, a lot of people who believe that there are far fewer, but that's based on U.S. Census data. It is accurate data. It is the truth that many people, and it's growing, and it's been growing every year. And not only that, but more and more of us are in health insurance plans that are inadequate. The insurance industry is now trying to move all of us into either limited benefit plans or high deductible plans, or plans that feature both high deductibles and limited benefits. And that's making more and more of us underinsured. At least 25 million more Americans, in addition to that 50 million, are underinsured.
Right. And can you define, what does underinsured mean?
Underinsured means that you pay your premiums, you think you've got insurance coverage that's going to be there when you need it, but often when you do get sick and if you do get injured, you will find that you have to pay a lot of money out of your own pocket before your insurance company will pay a dime, or you're not covered at all. And a lot of these limited benefit plans don't cover hospitalization, for example. Many people don't understand this, that a lot of the plans that they're paying really good money for is nothing more than junk insurance. The insurance companies are profiting. 2010 was one of their most profitable years ever, and that's partly because they've been shifting more and more of us into these junk plans and high deductible plans. And a lot of Americans are having to spend at least 10% of their incomes out of their own pocket for medical care, even with insurance.
You, I believe the president actually quoted you at one point. Whether he quoted you or not, I believe this is a quote attributed to your information, that insurance companies are not only encouraged to find reasons to drop the seriously ill, they are rewarded for it. Well, how are they rewarded, and what are the mechanisms that they use for people who actually have plans, but then they just basically don't pay what they should pay?
The president did quote me in a speech that he gave to Congress in September 2009. It was based on my Senate testimony. And what I said during that testimony was that health insurance companies deceive people, they dump the sick, and they confuse us. They don't give us the information we need. And they do make it impossible for us to understand our policies. They make it increasingly difficult for us to even buy the insurance we need because of pre-existing conditions and other things. What they are doing is their number one objective, at least the for-profit companies, and just by the way, 1 out of every 3 of us in this country is enrolled in a benefit plan that's operated by one of the very large for-profit health insurance companies. They're all traded on the New York Stock Exchange. What they do, their number one objective is to make sure that they're meeting Wall Street's financial expectations. They want to make sure that they're earning as much money as the shareholders expect they earn every 3 months. and that they are not spending more money on medical claims than investors want them to spend. And to be able to meet Wall Street's relentless profit expectations, they have to engage in these practices that have resulted in more and more of us not being able to buy insurance, or finding that insurance companies cancel our insurance when we get sick.
I'm sure many of our viewers are very interested to know what your conversion was, your so-called road to Damascus moment. But just before we get to that, can you talk a little bit about what you actually did as a PR person for, was it Cigna that you worked for?
Cigna was the company I worked for most recently. I left my job at Cigna in 2008. I had previously worked for Humana, altogether for about 20 years in both companies. And I was head of corporate communications. That was my title. I was the top PR guy for the company, and I was the chief spokesman for the company. I dealt with the media, primarily the national media. I was the person who explained to the financial media, for example. One of my responsibilities was to handle financial communications. So I had to know in a great deal of detail how the company made money and what it did to make money every 3 months, because these companies have to report their earnings to the SEC and to shareholders every 3 months. I also was Cigna's representative in Washington at a lot of meetings at the trade association level, and I was part of a group of fairly small group of people who, over the course of many years, helped develop PR campaigns to influence lawmakers and to manipulate public opinion to influence public policy. So I was involved in spin at both the corporate level and the industry level. I was very much involved in the effort to kill the Clinton plan, because the insurance industry was afraid that if it were passed, that insurance company profits might not be as great as they had been. And I was involved in efforts ever since then to defeat meaningful healthcare reform measures like the Patient's Bill of Rights that had bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. John McCain and Ted Kennedy were co-sponsors of the Patient's Bill of Rights, but the insurance companies didn't like that, and I was part of the effort to make sure it didn't pass Congress, and it did not.
Again, I definitely want to ask you, but you keep coming up with very interesting elements in terms of this story. So how to an average American citizen who looks at Washington, seeing as good intentions, at least at times, in terms of the types of things you just mentioned, how does the insurance company actually kill those bills? I mean, how does the process actually work, that they're able to go to elected officials and somehow, get single payer completely off the proposal?
It's both direct and indirect. The direct way, of course, is by your paid lobbyists. The insurance companies have dozens, actually hundreds of lobbyists on retainer all the time. Many on staff, and some that they contract with from big law and public affairs firms in Washington. The other is more indirect, and that involves manipulating public opinion. They want us as Americans to believe things that are not true, and they spend an enormous amount of our premium dollars to conduct research into determining what language would work best for us, or actually against us, but best for them, to get us to think certain ways. For example, they wanted Americans to think that the Obama health care plan, and the plan that was ultimately passed by Congress and the President signed, was a government takeover of the health care system. Well, it was nothing of the kind. But they crafted that phrase to make sure that we believed it, and they were able to get their allies in Congress and in business and in the media to repeat that over and over and over again, to the point that people started believing it. People did not read the legislation. In fact, I'm sure that only a tiny percentage of Americans have actually read the healthcare reform law, but they have opinions about it, and their opinions are based on what they've been told by people that they trust. The problem is a lot of the people that they trust have themselves been greatly misled and are unfortunately feeding us all a bunch of lies. It's just as simple as that.
Right. When and why did you leave the industry? And not only leave the industry, but become an advocate for reform.
I left my job in May of 2008. I had just had it after 20 years. I had become increasingly aware of what the insurance companies do to meet Wall Street's expectations, to satisfy investors. and how they indeed dump the sick. They dump them in many ways. They do cancel our policies when we get sick. And there was a woman who testified before Congress around the same time I did, who told lawmakers that she got a notice from her insurance company that they were canceling her coverage while she was in the midst of being treated for breast cancer because she had presumably failed to disclose that she had been treated for acne at some time in the past. And she, of course, she couldn't believe it, but they canceled her insurance. They, in the goodness of their hearts, they refunded her the premiums that she had paid, but she was left of course, that didn't come anywhere close to covering the amount of money she had to pay out of her own pocket for her own cancer care. And a lot of people file for bankruptcy. They lose their homes when things like this happens. And people lose their homes even when they have insurance because they have to pay so much out of their own pocket. I became increasingly aware of these practices, and I just could not in good conscience continue to serve as a spokesman for this industry. So I left. There were 2 or 3 things, though, that really made it necessary for me to leave, not because I was getting any pressure from my employer, but because I just couldn't, again, in good conscience, continue to work for a company that was making life and death decisions, quite frankly, and causing deaths. I wrote in my book, Deadly Spin, that 45,000 people die every year because they don't have health insurance, and it's a true statistic. And I have to admit that I was behind that. I played a role in making that unfortunate statistic a reality in this country.
Right. I worked for a number of years as an environmental and social justice activist and had met with executives of mining companies and other industries that are doing, quite clearly extremely damaging things in terms of blocking climate change policy, in terms of removing indigenous people from their land, always justifying it that their lives are going to be better, they're going to have better economic opportunities, they're actually doing a good thing. And my question always, and I have asked them, how do they continue to do it? And so you're one of the few people in this country, certainly the position that you held, who has come out and literally gone to the other side. Why aren't there more executives? Surely they know what they're doing. You were very aware of what you were doing. Apparently it bothered you for quite a considerable time, to the point where you felt ethically and morally you had to leave. Why isn't there a similar exodus in other industries or in the healthcare industry?
It's very hard. It's very hard to walk away from a good paying job, particularly when you're at the peak of your career and maybe toward the end of your career. What are you going to do after you do that? I almost didn't do it myself because you have to worry about retaliation from the industry you work for. You have to worry about not ever getting another job again, and that's frightening. Plus, you have to worry that you're going to be attacked, if not physically, at least your character attacked, and people don't want to take that risk. The other thing is that a lot of these folks begin to believe their own talking points. They tend to think that what they're telling the public is true. When you say something yourself, so many times you begin to believe it when you knew initially it was not true, or at least it was misleading. The other thing, though, is that executives can isolate themselves from the real world in many ways, and from the hardship that many of our people have on a daily basis. I often talk about the former CEO I supported. He was driven to work every morning by a driver who was on the payroll of the company in a car that the company owned or leased, and he went to work and never came down to the cafeteria to eat lunch with the employees. He was completely isolated. If he had to go to a meeting out of the city, the driver would take him to a private hangar, and he would take a private jet to the other city where another driver would take him to his meeting. When you live in that kind of a world, you're in a cocoon. You're isolated from the real world in many ways, and you just are not even aware of it. It is not part of your reality. And when that happens, you can go day by day in thinking that, well, I'm a good person. I help make sure some people have jobs and some people have coverage. So you pat yourself on the back that you're a good person and a good citizen, and you can completely ignore the realities that really are out there.
I, the, there's a great deal of information out there and attention about CEO executive salaries and compensation. Can you either tell us how much you are compensated or give us a ballpark figure for what a top PR person is paid?
PR people make a lot more money than journalists, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people leave the journalism profession. I'll have to admit, I did too. I was a reporter, and I was lucky at an early age to become a reporter in Washington. I covered Congress and the White House when I was still in my 20s. But it's a hard job, and long hours and fairly low pay. Certainly low pay compared to what most PR people make. And so I left. I left when I was in my late 20s to get into PR, and I ultimately was making a six-figure salary. I was not anywhere close to making the same amount of money that the CEO and some other top executives make. The chief financial officer, the top lawyer of the company, for example, make well into seven and eight figure, sometimes nine-figure incomes. It's just astonishing. The CEO of Cigna, when he took early retirement at the end of 2009, not only had an income of about $20-some million that year, but he walked away with a package of $111 million. So that's a lot of money.
Wow, that is a lot.
It's a lot more money than most journalists make, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, it's a lot more money than most people make, certainly in America. I have lived in Australia for the last several years, and I have Australian citizenship. In Australia, it would be a national scandal if one person lost their house due to not being able to afford their health care bills. What is it about America or why is it that we don't have, as the only industrialized country in the world, the only country that doesn't have national health care? Now, we've heard some of the ploys that the industry actually pursues. There's also seems to be some cultural issues when you have Tea Party people and other Americans actually protesting against the government providing, however you want to put it, expansion of Medicare, single payer, but government provided or facilitated health care.
There are a lot of Americans who are made to fear government, and it's been going on for many, many years. And that fear-mongering has been led by the special interest who stand to lose if there are more government regulations, for example. And that's one of the reasons. All these campaigns that I'm talking about have been led by the insurance industry, but every other special interest in this country that is resisting or is afraid of additional regulation will begin to make us fear through new fear-mongering campaigns, greater involvement of government in our lives. And they will try to make us believe that the fewer regulations, the better it is for us, when in reality it is just not the case in almost all cases. And the Americans think that everything we have is better than anybody else has around the world. So how can our system not be the best? How can Australians, how can the Canadians and the folks in Japan and Europe possibly have a health care system that's better than us? So we have this mindset, and the special interests know this, and they know how to work us. They know how to get us to think certain things and act in certain ways, and vote against our own vote against our own self-interest.
Yeah, and that's the really stunning thing when you see people literally voting against what they supposedly believe in or want to have happen, etc.
That's true.
Yeah. So, what is your opinion or view of the recent legislation that was passed at the federal level?
I felt it was necessary to get it passed. It fell far short of what I think it should have been, and I know it fell far short of what advocates of reform thought was achievable. But I think advocates were just not quite prepared for the onslaught of propaganda, of lies that would come from the insurance industry and its allies to influence and shape that legislation as it worked its way through Congress. And I saw that happening. I knew what was going to happen as Congress took up the legislation. The insurance industry had two major objectives. It needed to have reform. It wanted. So it was, I just want to make sure people understand, the health insurance industry and its business allies are very much in favor of some kind of reform. And that's because the business models of the private insurers are just simply not sustainable. You cannot keep shifting more and more of the cost of healthcare from them to citizens, to regular folks, and expect that people will continue to be able to buy their product unless they're forced to. So one of the major provisions in this legislation is a requirement that we all have to buy insurance. That was their top objective. And the second objective was to make sure there was no public option in the bill. And the public option would have been a government-operated health insurance plan. It would not have been an entitlement program by any means. We would have been able to pay premiums to this plan just as we do to private insurers. But they were able to persuade enough members of Congress or enough members of the Senate that this was a government takeover, that it was stripped out. And they made the American public fear the public option as well. So they got job one and job two done. Job two was to strip out the public option. So they needed that. But the bill also contains a lot of good things for consumers. It makes a lot of their most egregious practices illegal that should have been made illegal a long time ago. And that's regrettably what this new Congress is going to be trying to do, and that is to strip out the consumer protections, because that's what the insurance companies want them to do.
Relative to the new members of Congress, the Tea Party element, how do they justify that? I mean, how do they justify trying to eliminate those provisions that will actually, clearly, we're not talking about forcing single payer onto the American people. We're just talking about the worst provisions associated with, as I understand it, for example, prior conditions, prior existing conditions, things like that.
Yeah. What they will try to do is to make us believe that the consumer protections and the additional regulations will make our insurance more expensive. So that's the card they're going to play. And we can expect a huge campaign around that. And we just need to brace ourselves for it, because the Republican lawmakers in particular who will be behind this, and the insurance industry, which will be behind the scenes pulling the strings and providing the money to finance a misinformation campaign or disinformation campaign, will make us worry. They'll make us fear these consumer protections, which are in our best interest, by lying to us and telling us that if they are not changed, if they're not repealed, then our insurance premiums will go sky high. It's not true. But if they are not repealed, then the insurance companies won't be able to make as much money as Wall Street will demand next quarter, and the quarter after that, and the quarter after that.
In Australia, because there's single-payer national health care, private insurance is much cheaper. I mean, you get very good private health care cover for as low as $20 a month. So this argument, again, you just want to beat your head against a brick wall about the way they use this argument about increasing costs, etc. The costs are already so prohibitively high in America that it's, the system is headed for a terrible place.
Yeah.
And apparently the industry even recognized that, and that's why they wanted to force everyone to have to have private health care insurance.
It's a real shame, because one can get very cynical to look at what's going on. The insurance companies and their PR people and their lobbyists know that most Americans are not familiar with other systems. They don't know how effective they are operated, how much more cost effectively they're operated, and how they're able to achieve universal coverage, and how those citizens don't have to worry about losing their coverage or losing their homes or filing for bankruptcy. We just don't know different in this country, to tell you the truth. It's as simple as that. There's very little familiarity with the other systems, except the propaganda we hear from the insurance industry that make us think that those systems are socialism, and that people stand in long lines or wait for months and years to get the care they need. So there's been this campaign that's been going on for many years by the insurance industry to make us fear an Australian type system, or Canadian or French type system.
In the short term, I would like to hear your opinion about what is realistic about, is it realistic in 5 years' time, 10 years' time to have a single payer system? Or is it more realistic that the existing legislation could actually end up providing health care for all Americans, even if they have to, pay for it. But in the short term, how do we combat this control that the healthcare industry and other corporate entities have over Congress and over public opinion?
I think it's possible that in 5 to 10 years we'll have a radically different healthcare system. It might not be single payer in that short period of time, but I think we'll be moving toward a more equitable healthcare system. I think that's because people will finally wake up and realize that they're being fed a bunch of lies by special interests who care little about them and more about Wall Street and profits. More of us will become affected by our irrational healthcare system. And I also think that this legislation, I call it the law that was enacted, the end of the beginning of healthcare reform. It was a start. We needed to start. We needed to have some legislation as a kind of foundation. There are flaws with this law, but there are many good things too. So we need to, first of all, make sure that the good things are not repealed or stripped out. What we can do to fight back, I think, is make sure that we are informed, so that we're not so susceptible to the lies. That's asking a lot, quite frankly, of Americans, because we all work hard. We often will just not pay attention. I have a bumper sticker that says, "If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention," and that's a lot of what's going on. People need to become. That's what makes us participants in democracy, and make sure that we have a democracy that continues. If we don't stay informed and understand the truth and have places to go to get the truth, then my worry is that our democracy is not going to last very long. In fact, one of what I'm trying to do is to actually restore democracy, because in many ways we have a plutocracy already in this country. We have a system in which our government is controlled by the big money special interest, and we're just led to believe that we have democracy.
Yes. Has there been any repercussions to you leaving the industry? I assume some financial repercussions.
There have been, for now, I don't make nearly as much money as I was when I was an executive in the insurance industry, but the repercussions have been positive. I fear the worst, and I think that's why most people don't do this, because we're fear-based people. That's why the fear-mongering campaigns are so effective. We're afraid to take a risk, and this was the ultimate risk for me. I read the other day, though, that you're not to live a very happy life, a really happy life. You have to lead a life in which you not only are feeling that you're contributing something positive, but you're willing to give up your life for it. And I came to that ultimate conclusion. I had to face the fact that that people might not like what I'm saying, and I might be physically attacked. I haven't been, but and I hope I won't be. But you have to come to terms with the fact that something, a worst case scenario could indeed happen. But I couldn't, in good conscience, not do what I ultimately decided to do. I wish more people could get to that point, but I realize why it's so hard.
Yeah, it's particularly difficult because so many people are, and you obviously had a relatively high income. People can have high incomes, but also have high levels of debt, and high levels of other means that they don't feel they can, actually leave a job. There are things, again, having lived in Australia, and the provisions, government provisions to protect people are just so much more substantial. I just found out, and it might sound like a stupid thing to say, but I just found out that if you get fired from your job in America, you can't get unemployment. Which it just seems, so you can be, and without cause, you can be fired for no reason to do with anything you did that was wrong, and then you can't get the unemployment that you've been paying your own money into, or on the employer's behalf. So do you see hope? Do you have hope? And what, if you have or do have hope, why?
Well, I'm a hopeful, optimistic person, and I think that we can do better. I think as a society, in many ways, we're a much better society than our society was 20, 40, certainly 50 years ago. I mean, look at the enormous changes in our society that I think are positive. In my lifetime, I've seen changes in civil rights. It's just been a remarkable change. And I think in many ways our fight for a more equitable healthcare system is the civil rights movement of our era. And I think that then that we will succeed. I think that more and more people will eventually come to understand that we've got a fundamental problem with our health insurance system, our health care system, that can be fixed and must be fixed.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I would just like to add that people, just to reiterate, people really need to get engaged. They need to stay informed. They need to be skeptical, quite frankly, as well, to be aware of the presence of spin in their lives that is constant, and to stay informed and be engaged citizens in our government, and also just to make sure that we are communicating with members of Congress, not just voting, that our responsibility doesn't end there, but to communicate what we think is the right thing, and making sure that people in elected positions understand that, and just be active citizens.
Great. Wendell Potter, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Let's just hope it all recorded. Yes, the red light is still on.
Okay. Well, thank